Full moon in Pisces, traditional Chinese medicine, acupuncture, how astrology helps us, and why it's so important to many of us in this post pandemic era. You are going to want to listen to episode 48 of Inspiring Insights, friend. Welcome back to the Inspiring Insights podcast, the podcast that gives you more than just inspiration. We give you real world wisdom on holistic health and living up to your utmost potential. Today, on the 48th episode, we are here with Laura Burns, acupuncturist and traditional Chinese medicine practitioner. Laura is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the interplay of our physical, emotional, and spiritual health. She blends her love of the creative arts and astrology and merges her passions for both the art and practice of healing into her everyday life. Laura operates on the belief that a fundamental aspect of health is an authentic expression of who we truly are. Go ahead, check her out at lauraburns.ca. I will drop all of her links below in the show notes for you listeners. So, without further ado, open up your minds, settle into this full moon in Pisces for episode 48 of Inspiring Insights. All right, welcome to the show, Laura. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you.
Of course, of course. So, I guess my first question for you is, what kind of brought you into Chinese medicine, into learning that path, and give us a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, sure. So it kind of caught me by surprise when I found Chinese medicine, actually. And I'll sort of tell you how I got there. My my first career was actually in the arts. So I trained and worked as a professional actor for 10 years. And so that was really like the first, leap that I made was from acting to Chinese medicine. And people think like, oh, that's such a big shift. And it is, but at the same time, that's really where I started to learn about the body, right? So I went to Ryerson University. They're actually changing the name now. So I apologize. I don't know what it is or if
Oh,
it's been
okay.
announced. Yeah, but it's not going to be called that for that much longer. But anyway, it was a good program, 4 years, really intensive, like, 6 days a week, 14-hour days kind of thing. And
Mhm.
most of it was really working with our body because it's a profession that recognizes that that's your tool, that's your resource, right? And so we would have classes in movement, we would have voice, speech, those were two separate classes, anatomy. And really that's where, yeah, I started to kind of get in touch more with my body and learn about relating to other people. We were even doing things like body scans, which now are kind of type
Mhm.
of meditation that people talk about, and it's kind of trendy, but like we were just doing that to kind of, yeah, use our body as a resource. Um, so while I was acting, I actually started working at a health food store, which was really pivotal for me because I'd had digestive issues my whole life, basically since like 6 months old.
Mhm.
And I was born in the 80s. So as I grew up, I thought I was making healthy choices. But, the 80s were like pretty misguided, like a lot of, low fat, this and that, and really just packed with like sugar and aspartame and
Yeah.
all that stuff. Right. And I'm sure there are things now that when we look back at this time, we're going to like cringe a little bit. But I just feel like the 80s were particularly bad. 80s, 90s, I guess. And anyway, so I started working at this health food store and I decided to become gluten-free and dairy-free, in like 2007 when it was kind of weird. It was still a little bit fringe to do that.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of, a bit annoying when I would go home for holiday meals and stuff like that and, have all these restrictions. And now like half my family kind of lives like that anyway. Um, but I felt a lot better. And I still needed a little bit of extra support. So I went to see who I thought was a naturopath because someone I was working with said, "Oh, yeah, go see my naturopath." Right. So I went to go to her and she wasn't a naturopath. I thought she was a wizard because I was just so impressed by the work that she was doing. But she was a Chinese medicine practitioner. And so I
Mm.
didn't really know what that was. And I was just so enchanted by the work that we were doing. Because in the meantime, I guess I missed saying that while I was acting, I really was interested in the healing arts. I had a feeling like I'm going to make a move towards that, but I didn't know what I wanted that to be, because I was really interested in body work, like massage. I was interested in nutrition, right? Probably from working at this health food store.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was interested in counseling, but I have two parents who are counselors, and I just, in a way, like, you don't really want to follow in their footsteps, right? So I didn't know what it was going to be. And then when I went to see this Chinese medicine practitioner, I realized, oh, it actually incorporates all of the above. It has like body work, right? It has the acupuncture, acupressure, some massage. It has nutrition. Chinese medicine nutrition is amazing. Just makes so much sense. Like my whole body just says yes to it, And, I'm definitely not a counselor, and a lot of my patients have therapists, or I will refer if I feel that's appropriate to do so. But, there's a piece of that. I'm a cheerleader, right? For my patients. And, I like to help guide them through difficult situations with their body or stress in their lives. And in Chinese medicine, the emotions are also woven into the medicine. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can talk, like there is a place for that, to talk about the emotions and how they're impacting the body. You don't have to, but you can. And so it incorporated all of that, plus herbal medicine, which I love, and the spirit level stuff. So I don't know if you know, but each organ system in Chinese medicine has an associated, quote, spirit. Like think about like willpower for one, or the part of us that dreams, that's also accounted for in Chinese medicine. So again, like you can go to these, big places, but you don't have to. But this is why I love just the scope of it. I know the word holistic is kind of thrown around a lot now, or overused, I guess, but it really is. So that's how I went from acting to TCM. I found that and was like, yeah, I think this is it, and started studying it and really loved it. So I kept going.
Oh wow, I love that journey. And it continues, right? It
Yeah,
continues. So
it's
today, yeah,
yeah.
you are on you're still, practicing as a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner. But I understand that you have a pretty varied interest in astrology as well, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. It must be, part of I have some Gemini placements, right? So, I like to keep learning and, kind of synthesizing different things, right? So, yeah, definitely my main practice is Chinese medicine, and I love it, and that's not going to change. But I am also interested in astrology. It's kind of always fascinated me, but it wasn't until, the last sort of year or two that I really dove in. But as a teenager, I remember learning about, you learn about your sun sign, right? And you're like,
Mhm.
okay, some of that resonates, some of it probably doesn't because it's so general. Uh, but then the other time I got introduced to astrology was actually in Central America. I was there for a little while with my sister who was working there, and she came across this book about Mayan astrology, which I still don't
Mm.
know very much about. But the book was in Spanish, and she was able to kind of read some of it. And we were just blown away by that. And so it's always kind of been in the back of my mind. And then when I was studying Chinese medicine, I was taking some Ayurveda classes as electives. And the teacher, Louisa Ormond, who's incredible, she's just this wealth of knowledge. I just love her so much. When she was teaching, I found out that she also practices astrology, Western and Vedic astrology. And I decided to study with her separately, sort of after I graduated, and took some classes. And then I got busy and, life, right? So I didn't totally pick up that thread or continue it. But last year when the pandemic hit, and I had more time, right? Like my weekends at home and stuff. And I think a lot of people, are trying to go like, why is this happening? Right. And just getting really curious and looking into things.
For sure.
And yeah, it was a time where I just sort of dove in more to astrology. I started studying online traditional astrology with teacher Kelly Surtees, and I'm still making my way through her online courses. But then this summer, I took an evolutionary astrology class, which is more of a modern approach. And that also had this live component with a class, which was really exciting for me. And so I finished that, and the journey continues. I'm in the early stages of that as a practice, and I'm very transparent about that. But I am doing some readings, and so far so good. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's kind of like these three things, right? But when I look at them all together, I realize I have a through line, right? Like acting is people in relationship to each other. And TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, is people in relationship with their bodies. And then astrology is people in relationship to the universe, right?
Yes, I love
I'm
that.
like, there is a connection. Yeah.
That's so good. Laura, I'm curious, you mentioned, natal astrology, and I think on your website you have it mentions medical astrology. And I think you just said another one, shout out to Louisa, Vedic astrology, I think.
Yeah.
What are all the differences, if you can maybe just pinpoint a few differences? Because I feel like, yeah, a lot of my friends as well are kind of just going through life and trying to make meaning of things. And I think like
Yes.
looking to the stars and the sun and the moon placement really helps with that.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, we don't connect it to anything. And so what you say, there's natal, there's medical, I'm sure there's probably more types, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So all of them are sort of casting a chart, right? Looking at a snapshot of the sky at a point in time. And
Mm,
so natal astrology is looking at your birth chart. So trying to understand who you are as a person more through looking at your chart. And that's like really my primary interest. Medical astrology, I have been studying a little bit, but I have a longer road to go there. But I do have that interest, right? Through the kind of work that I already do.
hmm.
But basically, it's looking at that and looking at focusing more on still natal astrology, but focusing more on your health aspects in the chart. So there are like your house of body, your house of, day-to-day routines and health routines and mental health and stuff like that. So that's a whole sort of realm. Then there are other kinds of uses of astrology as well. For example, electional astrology, which would be casting a chart for a certain time to try to say pick a most auspicious day for something like to get married, right? That
Mm.
kind of thing. And you can also look at synastry charts. So that would be, how does my chart, overlap with your chart? And, what are the energies there, right? Sort of like, how do those planets connect with each other?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, nice. Yeah, because my background is, I'm delving more and more into the Celtic cosmology and
Oh, beautiful.
yeah, and more I find that it is, Druidry, the people that lived in Ireland even before the Celts got there, really based their whole lives on it was pagan, right? It was just following the sun and the stars and the moon and
Wow.
the rituals across quarter festivals, the solstices, the equinoxes,
Yes.
all of that. It's all really similar to what I would consider, witchcraft these days, or
Right.
yeah, some more pagan traditions of North America, which is
Yeah, I
super
think so
cool.
many cultures have their own version of it, right?
Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we kind of got that out of the way. One random question.
Yeah.
Is the Chinese zodiac, do you learn that in traditional Chinese medicine as well? Speaking of
You don't
astrology?
really.
Okay.
Like we heard about it and there's like the year of this or that, right? But
Hmm.
that's pretty much my only understanding of it. I haven't been introduced to a lot of resources on that. I'm sure there are, right? Because again, like each culture has their system of like studying the sky and planets. But yeah, I know it exists, but I don't have we didn't learn that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
nice. And
Yeah.
so, you know, when most people think about Chinese medicine, at least, a lot of people in my circle, they mostly just go to acupuncture. Their brain goes directly to acupuncture. And so let's talk a little bit about acupuncture, but maybe you can delve a little bit more into other things that you do in Chinese medicine and how it can really help people who are, maybe thinking of delving a little bit outside of Western medicine.
Yeah, sure. So I think, well, yeah, a bunch of things to say about that. So one of the things I think that Chinese medicine really thrives at, and a lot of other, systems of medicine too, is prevention.
Hmm.
So looking at sort of day-to-day things that can really help you live a healthy life, right? Before things kind of get to be, acute or an emergency. And sometimes that's a hard sell, because when you're like, you haven't really noticed things starting to kind of break down yet, there's less impetus for maybe that change, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's one thing I think that the medicine really shines at. And acupuncture, yeah, it is a big part of what I do because you can do so much with that. Acupuncture is kind of bringing the body into the parasympathetic state, which is the rest and digest. It's that place of healing, right? Because we spend so much time in the sympathetic state of our autonomic nervous system, which is the fight or flight or freeze. And that's not where, our body can repair itself. So that's just like one very basic level of acupuncture benefits, but it's also getting more specific than that because there are other tools that do that too, right? Like meditation. But with acupuncture, you're using the map of the body, the meridians that are connected to organ systems, and you are basically redirecting traffic. Like, where is their stagnation? Where is their pain? Where is their blockages? How can we move that and then use that to resource the, organ systems that are a little more deficient, right? So we're bringing the body into balance because that's really what health is, according to Chinese medicine. What is balance, right? Well, it's homeostasis in a way. Our body is always trying to bring us back to this place of homeostasis and balance, and sometimes it just needs a little bit of guidance.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, acupuncture is amazing. It can also activate your own neurotransmitters, right? Which is why it can just feel so good. But sometimes you need a little bit more than acupuncture. And so Chinese medicine, which includes acupuncture, also includes other tools. So things like cupping. Have you had cupping?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think too, when the Olympics are on, all the
Yeah.
swimmers have the
like the famous like Michael Phelps picture of like the big like cupping mark on his arm. So for anyone listening who doesn't know, cupping is basically use these cups and they become like little sections on parts of your body, like especially on like the bigger muscle groups. So like your back, right? And you help to draw out any stagnation that's happening in certain areas. You can either do static cupping or sliding cupping. And that can sometimes be a little more effective, because you're helping to like remove some toxicity in the body through that.
Feels amazing, by the way.
It
If
feels
anybody
so good. It
has
feels so
not
good.
tried cupping,
Yeah,
yeah,
despite how
definitely
the
go get
marks
it.
look, like it feels so good. And the darker the marks, it means you were more stagnant. So you really needed it, like if you get those.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another tool that is similar to cupping, kind of. It's called gua sha, which is like a scraping technique. So you use this tool. It's like not painful, but it sort of feels like getting like someone's really working like knots in your back or something. And again, you're like working to bring up that what's called gua sha really stands for red sand, which is the sort of marks that you tend to get. It looks like little red dots sometimes when you're pulling out that toxic heat.
Yes.
Because we look at, so for example, when would you use that? You would use that when, let's say someone has a real knot in their shoulder, in the back of their shoulder blade kind of thing. And it's painful. In Chinese medicine, pain is stagnation. And so we want to use tools that help to like move and bring that out. You could also use it if someone is just like coming down with something like getting sick or something like that. Although I'm not really treating a lot of people with that right now, unfortunately, but it is a tool you can use because in Chinese medicine, they map the body in layers. So usually when you're fighting something that is a virus you've caught from like the outside world, you can work with like cupping and scraping to help it not penetrate more deeply into the body. Yeah. And then there's also moxibustion, which is an amazing technique. It's it's an herb, I'm sorry, it's mugwort, which you warm on certain acupuncture points of the body. And there are different techniques of application, but that's it sort of in a nutshell. And what it does is it nourishes blood and it moves. So sometimes if you have like chronic pain that's more from a deficiency place, it's kind of cold, worse in the winter, you might want to use moxibustion to add a little more to the body. Also, if you have really light periods and you want to build blood, you can use moxa. If you want to build white blood cells, I just did this with a patient who was in between like, chemo drug rounds, and her white blood cells had to get up to a certain number in order to start the next round. And, it's pretty high stakes, right? So I'm like, let's bring in the moxa, and it worked.
Nice.
Yeah. And so that's one technique. And then also the herbs. Sometimes you need to take something, especially if you're really deficient. Acupuncture might not be enough to help build. And so you want to nourish with herbs and nutrition, I should say. Food is medicine as well.
Of course, yeah. And, even just throughout your description, you talked a little bit about, hot and cold. And I love that aspect of Chinese medicine, how it relates in terms of temperature and dryness
Yes,
and in each of our foods, depending on food groups and everything, that really, they can fall into any of those categories.
absolutely. Yeah. Because it all comes back to the balance, right? And each food, for example, has certain properties, heating, cooling, certain flavors that are attributed to certain organ systems. And so, there's a lot that you can do at home, which is kind of one of the empowering things about seeing a Chinese medicine practitioner is you can learn some tools to do in your own life.
Yes, and full
Hmm.
circle, really brings it back to prevention.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. And
Yeah.
so, we talked a lot about physicality of that type of medicine. And earlier you talked about some emotions and, the whole dynamics of Chinese medicine, but maybe even just let's talk about non-Western medicine as a whole. How can we how can we use that to help us with our own emotions and help us kind of achieve that homeostatic balance, but within our minds?
Yeah. Really good question because so much comes from our mind. We're really emotional beings. We like
Hmm.
to think we're operating from this rational place all the time, but in fact, like, our emotions are really the first responders. And so the more that we can tap into that, the more space we'll have to choose how we want to respond and participate in our life, and feel less like controlled by that. Gives you more agency and will make you healthier physically, right? Because a lot of what we talk about now is like stress, right? But
Yes.
stress is usually a blanket term for a bunch of emotions, right?
Right.
Like, I'm feeling exhausted, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm like grieving, I'm whatever. And so in Chinese medicine, all the organ systems have an associated emotion. And so let's say someone is grieving and coming in for treatment. I'm going to work with the lung system as part of it because in Chinese medicine, the lungs are associated with grief and sadness. The liver is associated with, it's a real spectrum, anywhere from depression, frustration, irritability, anger, and rage. They all look at that as actually like one spectrum.
Mm.
And so with any of those things, which are obviously, super common, like we all get irritable sometimes, right? Especially like maybe, premenstrually or something. We want to work with the liver. The heart is associated with joy and also sort of excess joy, right? Almost like that euphoria or mania sometimes that can get a little too fiery, right? And
Yes.
then the kidneys are associated with fear or shock. And the spleen, stomach, digestive is associated with worry or overthinking. And so I also want to just state that all of the emotions are totally healthy in Chinese medicine, totally valid, totally healthy. It's only when we get stuck in them that creates disease, in our body. So the
Right.
more that we can work with our emotions, and that, we can do that through acupuncture, lifestyle adjustments, etc. I think that's a huge part of where this medicine can shine. And I think it's so important. I just think so much of you know our ailments, or at least the extremeness of things that happen in our bodies, there's a huge stress component because it just creates like havoc in all of our systems, right?
Mm. Yes.
Yeah.
Laura, I studied naturopathic medicine for the
Yeah.
folks. Most of my listeners already know that, but and we only kind of brushed the surface of Chinese medicine in our studies. But one of my favorite professors, and he was our Chinese medicine prof, um, he said, the only negative emotion is the one that's not expressed.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think, like you say, emotions are actually okay to go through, just because you're feeling depressed or feeling rage. I think we get this notion that we shouldn't express those because we label them as bad. right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And certain emotions, are labeled as worse, depending on maybe what gender you fall into, or like perceptions of that, etc.
Yes.
For example, people who identify as more female, then, often I think it's just not okay to be angry, right?
Yeah.
Because you associate that with more of like a masculine trait. And I think that's really dangerous, right? Because then you hold a lot in.
Yeah, and we polarize ourselves. So we think about
Hmm.
these things and then we end up trying to do the opposite, but what we really do is suppressing it,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so I love that what you said about just, getting it out and having it just not necessarily on display, but just working through it and like sitting in that discomfort.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like learning to sit in it. There's a couple aspects to it. I think one is the expression and one is the sitting in it,
Hmm.
rather than like block, trying to block it or always distract. Sometimes you have to just move on with your day, but make a time to process it later, right? But
Yes.
I think a lot of unconscious choices are made from trying to protect ourselves from feeling discomfort,
Yes.
and emotions are uncomfortable, right? So a lot of it comes from that. But then learning how to express it and how to express it in healthy ways.
Yes, I love that. So let's just talk about the organs and their associated emotion again, because that was really cool. And I think a lot of people, when you talk about the spleen and the stomach, are you talking about like the actual literal spleen and stomach, or are you talking about kind of like the philosophical organ system or like the
Oh, that
theory?
is such a good question. I'm really glad you asked that to clarify, because in Chinese medicine, they actually differentiate between the organ itself and the system. And
Hmm.
the system has a whole set of responsibilities. It has the responsibilities of the organ, liver, like detoxification, etc. But the system relates to so much more. The liver, for example, relates to your the movement of qi and blood through the whole body, the blood and through to the menstrual cycle. It
Mm.
opens to the eyes, so sometimes when you're having pain behind your eyes, like a migraine or something, you're looking at the liver. So and it controls the hun, which is the domain of like our dreams, sleep. So yeah, the system is actually differentiated through using a capital letter, and when they're talking about the organ itself, they just use a lowercase letter.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Interesting, right?
nice.
So
Good
it
to
is it
know.
is both. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like Bitcoin, like capital B, small b.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah.
I love that. And yeah, so I'm really interested in the organ philosophy and even just this kind of I can't remember what it's called now. The depleting cycle, is that what it's called? The like the
Oh, like
five
the
star
yeah,
system.
like the generating or the controlling cycles, those things. Those are
Yeah,
how the organs, relate to each other, right?
basically, yeah. So like you
Yeah.
say, like you have a migraine, okay, you might have something to do with like your liver,
Yeah.
but then that fire could rise upward into your heart, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. One of the things that are so amazing about Chinese medicine or even Ayurveda or traditional medicines, is that they're trying to understand the fundamental principles of the universe, right? Like the natural laws of the universe, nature, and applying that to ourselves. Not only that, like we are that. And so
Hmm.
it's bringing that down to the body. So what does fire do? Fire rises when there's heat in the body. It's going to go up. It's going to affect your heart, your head, your face,
Mm.
um so yeah, it's like looking at how things move, through those principles in the body.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah.
Listeners out there, please go check out Laura and her work. It's amazing, honestly. And if you haven't ever been to an acupuncturist or a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, and you're curious, just go. Even if you're feeling good, I think there's a
Yeah.
real benefit to just going and seeing. What can we prevent? What can we help ourselves
Yes.
out with?
I love when people come and they're feeling good. They're like, I don't know what I want, like just do what you feel is good. And I can like feel the pulse, feel things in that. And also then it can be an experience for someone. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Amazing.
Mhm.
Can we shift the conversation a little bit? I love what you talked about and kind of more described for the listeners, exactly what traditional Chinese medicine entails, or maybe just scrape the surface.
Mhm.
But I would love to kind of pick your brain on the rituals of a more like kind of cyclical nature, like we talked about earlier, celebrating the equinoxes or celebrating the solstices, and how we can, like you said too, kind of bring that into our own body and into our own life, kind of embody that as the seasons change. Here in Toronto, we're heading into fall now, celebrating the equinox
Yeah,
pretty soon.
Wednesday. Yeah.
Yeah. And today is a full moon in Pisces as well. So maybe we
Yes.
could chat a little bit more about nature and astrology and what that means for folks. How, I guess first of all, how can we connect with it if folks are interested?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you started to talk about it already, where we're not separate from nature, right?
Yeah.
Like to think we are, at least capitalism does, because that's how we got to this place of like climate change and everything, because we think we're like separate, but we have to honor these natural cycles. So whether you're looking from like Chinese medicine lens or astrology lens, like anything in nature, right, has natural cycles of growth, death, rebirth. And I think there are a bunch of places that we can look at. One is, yeah, the seasons, like you said, and even in Chinese medicine, they take into account the seasons. Your pulse can feel different at different times of the year. The if you want to connect with the seasons and those cycles, you can take some of the principles of Chinese medicine. One would be in the winter, you slow down a bit more. You get a
Mm,
little more rest, right, to align with the light, the hours that are daylight. But at the same time, you need to balance, right? So then you want to eat foods that are a little more warming, a little more, a little bit more spice, like well cooked soups and stews, stuff like that.
hmm,
Whereas in the summer, it's a little more yang season, right? So we can do a little bit more, especially if we have rested in the winter. If
hmm.
we haven't, you might not be able to do as much in the summer. But then you also want to balance with cooler foods, things like coconut or sorry, cucumber, watermelon, mint, things like that.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. And then one other simple tool for connecting with cycles is your breath, like your inhale and your exhale. That's a
Totally.
cycle, right? And we forget that we have access to that. And so you can use intention with your breath to draw things into you and let things go. But then, of course, the moon. So I'm a Cancer rising, my chart rules the moon. So I am obsessed with the moon.
Yes.
And it's a great way to honor the natural rhythms. So new moons tend to generally be a good time to set intentions and to act on those and kind of play those out through the 2 weeks that it's building towards the full moon. And then the full moons are generally a time to release something. There's always
Mm,
going to be some exceptions depending on the other planetary combinations, um but yeah, it's a good time to release something. They don't have to be dramatic, moves every month, right? But for example, like if you are wanting to start something, you can use a new moon to set an intention, right? And if you want to kind of use ritual with this, you could light a candle, you could write it down, you could, take an action to sort of, get it in the body and then out of you, start to, create that energy. Whatever it is, send an email, pitch something,
hmm.
Whereas full moons, it's kind of like illumination, right? So it's this conscious release of something. And for that, you might want to have a bath and feel things kind of wash out of you, or clean out your closets, declutter, right? That's a
Mm.
great, time to release. You could put out a podcast or whatever it is. Um, Sometimes it's thought patterns, right? Like today's a full moon in Pisces, conjunct Neptune. So it's bringing up like a lot of emotional stuff, and thinking about like what are our beliefs and are there thought patterns that aren't serving me, or which ones do I want to keep, which ones do I want to let go of, and maybe taking an action to honor that. um Menstrual cycles are also cycles you can work with if you're a human who menstruates. Even with acupuncture, we work differently at different points in the cycle. So to build right towards ovulation and then to move and clear after.
Yes.
Yeah. And then there are, with astrology, our natal chart is always static, but what's happening is there are transits around, like the planets are always moving. So they're always interacting with your natal chart, differently than somebody else's. And so, for example, like the full moon we're having today, where is that in your chart? Like, where's the sign of Pisces in your chart, kind of thing. And so if you're one of the reasons why it's nice to get an astrology reading is to look at the transits that are happening and go like, how can I best make use of these transits? And so, for example, a while ago, I had a Pluto transiting my moon transit. Okay. What that means is it can sometimes bring up old emotional patterns that are trying to be transformed. And so one thing I did was I made a shadow board where I just like wrote on my shadows, right, that were coming up. And I worked with it. I paid attention to it every day, kind of acknowledged it. And then when I felt ready, I tore it up and I burned all the pieces, and it was really powerful. So there are different lessons that the planets are offering us, right? And it's like, do we want to step into that? Or do we want to like pretend it's not happening,
Totally. Yeah. And I know that there are apps nowadays, like a number of different
Yes.
apps that people use to track where they are and, in that moon cycle or in that yearly annual cycle, where their planets are conjuncting and all that. I'm like probably butchering
No,
the
you're on it.
terminology.
Yeah. Conjuncting planets. Yes. It's when they
Yeah.
like stack on top of each other. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And yeah, I think, it doesn't always, it's not necessary to have like a full understanding of it. More so, like I said earlier, it's more so that people really want to just make meaning to what's going on. And
Yes.
how can we,
Yes.
yeah, like what can we let go of? How can we use this time, this transition, as you say, to let go or to move on or to do whatever we need to do. And transitions, I'm finding as a coach,
Yeah.
transitions are where people need the most guidance.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Because you're working on both at the same time. You're building and you're letting go. And
Yeah.
often, emotions come up with that, right? And I think, yeah, astrology is a really helpful tool for that, for anything, just gaining greater understanding of yourself, having this, seeing yourself reflected in the chart. It offers this perspective, and a language has been a really big one for me.
Mm.
Um, and it also can feel kind of validating, when you go through a hard time and that's reflected in the chart, it can feel just really validating, like it takes some of the feelings of like, oh, did I mess up my life? It doesn't take away wanting to, like, it's not to like hide behind difficult things and not take agency in your life. Like, oh, it's because my moon's in blah, blah, blah that I'm like, being a jerk right now. Like, no,
Right.
you know, not that. That's a bad use of astrology. But what it can offer is some validation. If you're having a hard time, it's like, well, yeah, these are tough transits. And here are some things that maybe they're trying to, show you, or ways you can best work with that, but also take some of the blame off yourself. I
Yes.
think we want to think we have all this control, because you look at astrology and it's like, how much fate do we have versus free will, right? Or like
Mm.
destiny versus free will. These, big conversation around that. But for me, it always comes back to co-creation, and so when something, crappy happens and you're, in a hard place, it's like, well, it's not all your fault. And if you're someone who feels like you want to have all the control, or you do have all the control, then what happens if something, shitty happens to you? Then you're going to blame yourself, right? And I think there's a real danger. I think there's real danger in even like the wellness industry of, blaming yourself if you don't have like, your thoughts in like the highest place all the time, or you're just, the toxic positivity or
Yeah.
whatever. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it helps with that, is what I'm trying to say.
In the
And
spiritual world too.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
toxic positivity is a real thing for sure. And it,
totally.
instead of, like you said, this the astrology really actually seeing you,
Hmm.
people spin it the other way and kind of put it back on. And it's like, oh, sorry, Mercury's in retrograde.
Right, right. I can't be on time. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh
I think the
man.
other kind of neat thing about astrology is, this is one of my theories. I don't know what you think about it, but I'll put it out there because it feels kind of true for me. which is, I think there's this resurgence in popularity of astrology right now. I think part of that is like the Pluto and Scorpio generation, millennials, who Pluto and Scorpio really wants to know why, really wants to dig deep and like figure out,
Mm,
that's why like therapy is a little bit more common now than it was before, things like that. But I think there's also this piece of it's connected to the why, but it's wanting to feel like we're connected to something larger. I think that there has been some falling away in terms of religion, like, people associating with certain religions. It's not
yes.
the case everywhere by any means. And astrology is not a religion. Just make sure I'm clear on that. But it can be a, practice of divination of some kind. And, it can be very humbling, right? You see these like forces of the universe and you know, just realizing that, yeah, there is this like greater organization to how things
Hmm.
work. And, there are lots of people who are practicing a certain religion that also are into astrology. They're not mutually exclusive, but yeah, I think that's
Yes.
another thing about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out too, because there is a sense of like in a world where, I was raised super Catholic and super
Hmm.
strict and,
Hmm.
my parents were super Christian themselves and it kind of goes back a couple generations, but I really felt the need to move away from that. And
Right.
now in my adult years, I'm looking though for a sense of meaning, right? A sense of
Yes.
purpose.
Yes.
And in a way, astrology and, even just connecting to nature, which is something greater
Yes.
than myself,
Absolutely.
right? And for my mom, and I have the utmost respect for her faith,
Hmm.
it's, she connects to something greater than herself through her religion, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing applies here. It's just maybe not necessarily the age of religion or continuation of
Exactly.
religion.
Yeah. And if it improves your daily life, then it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think, and it's also, yes, they're not mutually exclusive. And
No.
we all have to kind of put feelers into different things to feel them out and see if it works for us.
Yeah, explore, just explore. And I'll also throw that out that it doesn't, whether you learn about astrology or not, you're living your chart either way, but it doesn't make you, a better person because like about your planets and stuff, like it's great to want to live a conscious life no matter how you choose to do that. But I recognize it's a privilege for me to have the time to even study these things, even think about these things or talk to you, right? So it
Yes.
doesn't make you a better person or worse person, whether you're into this stuff or not.
Yeah, for sure. And Laura, I'm aware of the time here. Maybe just before we, clue up,
Yeah.
I would love to ask you if you have any kind of simple tools for our listeners. We talked about Chinese medicine today. We talked a lot about astrology today. Talked a lot about emotions and all of that interplay between the, physical, emotional, spiritual health of ourselves. So, are there any things that you use on a day-to-day basis or maybe even prescribe to people to help them connect with themselves a little bit more?
Hmm. Yeah, I like breath, just sitting. It's so simple, but sitting and breathing. And
Mm,
while you're doing that, pay attention to sensations in your body. Where do you feel openness? Where do you feel tension, discomfort? And then also paying attention to your emotions at the same time. Like, how do I feel about that? And if you can do that for sort of 5 or 10 minutes a day, a lot can shift or can bring up a lot of stuff that then you realize are things that you can take action on, right? Again,
mm.
it's like making them more conscious. And then you might want to, go to your practitioner and say, here's what I'm feeling, and, you know, work with someone on that.
Yes,
Hmm.
breath is so, so key. Yeah, and
Hmm.
there are a couple more episodes for everybody out there listening about breath that we have done.
Oh, good.
Some qigong as well. Just have a look through the YouTube
I'm going to
channel
check those out.
yeah,
Hmm.
or our Spotify account. Um, But Laura, it was so good to have you here. Any last final kind of words of wisdom for the listeners?
Yeah, pay attention. Go look at the moon, just watch, just observe nature and what it's doing. And,
Mm,
think about yourself as also being governed by the same, creative forces. Um, yeah, just get curious about that. Pay attention to that.
curiosity. It's
Hmm.
playful.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I have one more question for you, Laura, before I let you
yeah.
go, and that this is something I ask every one of my guests here. What keeps you inspired? What keeps you going?
Ooh, good question. Uh, kindness. Kindness I find really inspiring.
Mm.
And also, this might be weird, but we're gonna get weird right at the end. But I what keeps me inspired sometimes is remembering the fact that I'm gonna die. We're all gonna
Mm.
die. And I feel like you would think that thinking that, can create more anxiety in your day-to-day life, but actually I find it really a thing that helps me in my life. Like it makes the little things just seem, it puts things in perspective, and inspires me to make the most of my time here, which is really my goal as a human, right? Is like living, I don't know, self-actualization, right? All that stuff, but it really helps. Yeah.
Wow, I've never gotten that answer before. I love that so
Okay.
much.
Not too dark, not too dark.
It's a bit of a cliffhanger. Maybe we can
Yeah.
like have a whole other conversation about
That's
life,
right.
death, and
Yes.
rituals around it. And
Mm-hmm.
I know actually, yeah, you've done some end of life care
Yeah.
studies as well, which I find super fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I myself, I used to work as a birth doula, and
Oh, wow.
at the same time, the same kind of few years that I was working as a birth doula, my father passed away, and
Aha.
I found so many similarities actually to the whole process of birthing and the whole
Yeah.
process of dying and ushering a soul in or out of this world. Oh, so, so beautiful.
Both are sacred, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's juicy stuff. Maybe let's
We're gonna
reconvene for
have to
another
talk
chat
more.
on
Yeah.
that.
Thank you so much for
Yes,
having
thank
me.
you, Laura Burns. This has been episode 48 of Inspiring Insights. For everybody who wants to connect with Laura, we'll put her website and her Instagram below. Go check her out on Instagram, The Artful Acupuncturist,
Yeah.
the.artful.acupuncturist.
Yeah.
And her website is lauraburns.ca. Thank you again, Laura. Have
Thank
a
you so much.
splendid day, everybody. Hey everyone, it's Erin, Ishmisha Erin Edwards. As you know, my pronouns are they and them. Keeping on going forward with the non-binary life here at Inspiring Insights and Reawaken Co. As you know, I run a mindfulness company. I also do retreats. Basically, they are essentially every 8 weeks or so, 6 to 8 weeks on the cross-quarter festivals of the Druid Celtic calendar. The next one coming up is the autumn equinox. So feel free to check out my website, theerinedwards.com, THEERINEDWARDS.com. For more, you can get early bird discounts to all of my retreats. And feel free to contact me at any time if you have any questions about coaching, mindfulness, or intuitive medicine at hello@reawakenco.com. Don't forget the co.com. hello@reawakenco.com. Thank you so much for listening to Inspiring Insights, and I hope you're all doing so, so well.